Or if it's better than music, it's jazz.
Well, welcome once again to the Backward Glance for part 2 of my retro look at the Star Trek Voyager episode Death Wish. It's a pleasure to have you here, and let's dive right in. Yet before we visit the home of the Q, Janeway is resolved to find a solution that doesn't end in either Quinn's death or his reincarceration. She asks Q to reintegrate Quinn into the Continuum without punishment or revulsion. Q tells Janeway that such a promise cannot be made, but that the Continuum would like to offer an alternative proposal, as Q says, if they agree with her decision. He shows Janeway a vision of Earth and insinuates that he can send them all the way home from their lost position in the Delta Quadrant if she will but compromise her judgment in the Q's favor.
Now you see it, now you don't.
Of course, had Q been a human attorney, he could have faced disbarment or even criminal charges for attempting to bribe a legal official. But this is Q we're talking about, isn't it? Next, we return to the hearing room where Tuvok proposes his and Quinn's plan to visit the Continuum. Q calls it a ridiculous idea, stating that Janeway and Tuvok would never be able to comprehend what they see. But Quinn has a crazy way to help them understand that Q reluctantly agrees to. The quartet next appear on a never-ending desert road stretching from one horizon to the other, which prompts Janeway to sarcastically ask if this is the Q Continuum. Q asserts his foresight that the mortals would not understand by telling Quinn, "I told you so," which then begs Quinn to assert that the road is a manifestation of the Continuum, that he and Q hope will be understandable at their level. Now let me say that, when I first watched this episode, almost immediately I associated the road with another idea that helped me understand its implications. How many of you science enthusiasts out there may have thought of the Mobius strip or the Klein bottle as possible examples to think about the Q Continuum? The idea of an eternal or ongoing road that goes everywhere but then leads back to where it started is inherent in both the Mobius and Klein examples and gives us a framework of how to both visualize and think about higher dimensions of reality. Higher dimensions that our scientists tell us do in fact exist, at least mathematically, but which we do not have present access to, save theoretically. Now, when I say that I first thought of the Mobius and Klein examples, I am in fact talking about them more limitedly from the perspective of the Q's road going from one end of the universe to the other. I am not referring to them as the end of their existence or their ability, because I do happen to think that the Q occupy more and higher dimensions than just the four which the Mobius and Klein examples generally represent. But these are interesting benchmarks from which to begin to conceptually explore who and what the Q are. As we get off the road, we encounter several Continuum denizens who themselves are metaphysical representations designed to assist Janeway and Tuvok's comprehension. An old man with a book called The Old, a young woman with a magazine called The New, an upper-class couple playing a game of croquet, the balls of which are living planets in actual space. There is even a dog at rest on the ground. These are all representations of the Q's belief that they are somehow guardians or watchers of the universe, and that, from their high position, they are rightly endowed with this obligation. It is at this point that Quinn speaks of his life within the confines of his society, of how, when he was a respected philosopher, he praised and glorified the exalted nature of Q. But when he turned this honor into reproach and rebuke of the culture, he became persona non grata. And when he declared that continuum immortality was no longer the great joy the majority of his fellows wanted to go on asserting, and started trying to eradicate himself from existence, they exiled and imprisoned him. Quinn even praises Q as the irrepressible inspiration for his own desire to break free from the continuum's restraints and end his life, an account that surprises Q and raises his own self-doubt about being, as Quinn also calls him, a good little Q. Quinn tells Janeway that she wants him to convince her on grounds that she can relate to: disease, pain, the slow deterioration of mind and body. But Quinn says that when life no longer has meaning, when it can no longer be endured, when there is nothing of value or worth left to live for, then it must end. He tells her that for the Q, the disease is immortality itself. As clear as it is that Janeway has been swayed enough to potentially lean toward favoring Quinn, it is even more clear that Q himself is no longer even persuaded of his own advocacy of the continuum's position, and once returned to the hearing room, decisions by both Janeway and Q will hang in the balance, decisions that could change the very future of the entire Q Continuum forever. But before these monumental decisions are made, Q tries one last-ditch effort to sway Captain Janeway to his side by appearing in her quarters and asking if she entertained his offer to send Voyager back to the Alpha Quadrant. She directly and candidly informs him that his bribe will cut no figure in her judgment, a fact that Q had already insightfully assessed Janeway well enough to count on. He therefore tells her that he persuaded the Continuum not to return Quinn to his cell, but to assign him to the custody of another Q for as long as it takes. After some further back and forth between them, Q disappears and is not seen again until the hearing resumes. But now the time of decision has come, and Janeway, still conflicted by the task she has volunteered to perform, counts the costs of what that decision will mean. She speaks of her own aversion to suicide, of the moral consequences to the continuum of one of its members shedding himself of immortality in order to end his eternally long life, and his eternally long suffering, and ultimately of her belief that the rights and needs of the individual, in this case, must be regarded as above those of the state, no matter the unforeseen stumbling blocks that may arise. Janeway therefore rules in Quinn's favor and grants him asylum. Q urgently requests a sidebar to try and further argue his case, to make one last desperate half-court shot to the net before the buzzer, but Janeway refuses, and Quinn, recognizing his victory, demands that Q fulfill the oath the Continuum made to grant him mortality. With an unenthusiastic gesticulation, Q keeps faith with his promise and removes Quinn's powers. And for the first time in his everlasting existence, in all of his travels throughout the universe, amidst every interaction he's had with mortals, Quinn realizes that he now is, in fact, himself a completely physical being. Janeway makes a fervent appeal to Quinn to not so swiftly abandon his newfound mortality, and urges him to explore it with a reinvigorated zest for life. Unfortunately, this will not be the case, for as the episode comes to its close, we find Captain Janeway summoned to sickbay where a supine Quinn lies near death on a biobed. Having ingested a fatal poison, Quinn expresses his regret at having disappointed Janeway for, as it were, giving up on life. But he says that he would only have pretended to fit into a mortal existence. He declares that his willingness to face death is his final gift to the Continuum, and peacefully slips away. A saddened Janeway asks how Quinn got access to a deadly poison, and from the ethers of eternity appears Q, who declares that it was he who supplied Quinn with the instrument to end his life. An astonished Tuvok questions Q's logic, but Q stands firmly by his actions, stating that Quinn's courage to end his life taught Q a lesson about living his own. Janeway asserts her belief that the Continuum will be most displeased with him, to which Q answers that he indeed hopes so. He bids Janeway farewell and affirms that they will most certainly meet again someday. And upon this beat, the episode concludes. Now, this was not a happy episode where all's well that ends well, and as in many general Star Trek episodes, things work out. No, this was a hard episode to accept, with a bitter pill to swallow. It is one that, in the context of the Star Trek universe, had fateful repercussions, as the Q Continuum went to full-fledged civil war because of Quinn's choice, a civil war that had consequences not only in the higher dimensions which the Q occupy, but in the corporeal universe itself. In the context of the real world, it is one that compels, that forces us to confront the reality of suicide in multiple forms and for multiple causes, not just because of disease or physical pain, but also because of emotional distress and mental anguish. And let me leave the confines of the fictional universe for a second and say that because of the weightiness of this topic, I'm going to stop here and announce to anyone who may be listening within the sound of my voice that I am not, and I do repeat, not advocating suicide, whether it be self-inflicted or with the assistance of others, that I, like Captain Janeway, am averse to the very idea of someone ending their life, particularly for trivial or fanciful reasons. And if you are in fact contemplating severing your mortal coils because you presently believe you can no longer endure this world, I would personally strongly encourage you to reconsider that judgment. If you are within these United States, there are resources both at the national and many state and local levels which are available to help, of which the National Suicide Prevention Hotline is one. And please observe that number on your screen where someone is always there, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, to hear your plea and lend a compassionate ear to your circumstances. To return to the episode now, let me also add that I do not hold the opinion that Death Wish itself was advocating for large individual or broad societal enactment or acceptance of suicide or euthanasia. Instead, what I think is that it was asking us to vigorously contemplate if and when such potentiality should transform into action without societal judgment, and certainly without state intervention or prosecution. It was asking us to contemplate when these matters should be rightly left to the private concern of the individuals in question and or his or her closest significant others. And to the question of state prosecution, let us consider the real-world example of a man who was once famous in the United States for bucking the system, for defying the state, and helping scores of terminally ill persons to commit suicide. I want to consider the case of Dr. Murad Jacob Kevorkian, otherwise known as Dr. Jack Kevorkian, otherwise known as Dr. Death. Dr. Murad Jacob Kevorkian, also known publicly by the moniker Dr. Death, was a trained pathologist and euthanasia proponent with a degree from the University of Michigan, who openly believed in a hopelessly ill patient's right to die by physician-assisted suicide. Kevorkian is said to have assisted some 130 terminally ill patients to die between 1990 and 1998, with Dr. Death doing nothing more in each case except attaching the individual to a euthanasia machine which he had personally created. Actually, according to reports, he created two, one called the Thanatron, or Death Machine, on which the person him or herself would push a button that released a fatal cocktail of drugs or chemicals into their bodies. The other, created after his medical license was revoked, called the Mercitron, which was a gas mask through which was pumped a canister of carbon monoxide that effectively caused one to go to sleep and never wake up again. Kevorkian was tried 4 times for assisting suicides between 1994 and 1997, the first 3 times of which he was acquitted. The 4th time, in 1997, ended in a mistrial, and in 1998, Kevorkian was arrested and tried for a 5th time, this time for murder, after aiding the euthanasia of one Thomas Uke, if I am pronouncing that correctly, who was afflicted with ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. Kevorkian was convicted of second-degree murder in this case in 1999 and served 8 years of a 10 to 25-year sentence as a result. He was released on parole in June 2007 on the condition that he would not offer advice about, participate in, or be present at the act of any type of euthanasia to any other person, nor that he promote or talk about the procedure of assisted suicide. Kevorkian, however, violated this condition of his parole and spoke out in favor of euthanasia repeatedly and very publicly, and yet still managed to do so without being returned to prison. Now, while there were and are those whom regarded Dr. Kevorkian as a hero, perhaps even as a maverick and visionary ahead of his time, who helped the terminally ill to die with dignity, there are also criticisms of both his instrumentalities and his methods as a medical diagnostician. Some news reports suggest that a large swath of Kevorkian's patients were not terminally ill at all, or had not even complained of long-term pain. Others suggest that the end-of-life counseling of some of his patients was not long enough or thorough enough to properly diagnose their cases prior to euthanizing them. Still others suggest that Kevorkian euthanized patients who were not even physically ill, but instead suffered from severe depression, which he was not medically qualified to diagnose, and certainly not to treat. There were even reports that Kevorkian euthanized individuals who were later shown through after-death autopsies to have had no physical signs of disease whatsoever. These observations and criticisms of Jack Kevorkian led some to believe that his push for public acceptance of euthanasia was not only an extreme violation of the Hippocratic Oath, which all medical doctors take in some form, but that Kevorkian's advocacy was less about death with dignity at the end of life, but instead more about his own personal nihilistic view of the world. Now, I will of course leave judgment as to the rationale behind Kevorkian's values and actions up to you as an individual, based upon your own research about the man and his values as you so choose. But returning to Death Wish, this is some of the background that I think helped to shape the episode. And mind you, I am not saying that these events of the time frame specifically influenced Death Wish, but that instead we can hold up a mirror and see reflected some of the very powerful and, yes, controversial themes played out in the episode. Themes such as individual autonomy and personal rights versus collective social approval and state authority, the degree to which suffering must and can be endured before it should be allowed to end, and at the end, who gets to decide on what basis it should be permitted to cease. These are all valid questions to ponder, and in its usual manner, this episode of Star Trek Voyager wrapped those questions in a thoughtfully allegorical manner that challenged both our philosophical and ethical constructs and our imagination. I hope you've enjoyed this look back, this backward glance of Death Wish with me, and I anticipate you joining me again when we come together once more to reminisce and remember those days gone by. Along our path, we've taken a listen to a cover of the late great Michael Jackson's famous song, Human Nature, as done by saxophonist Nelson Rangel from his 2019 release, By Light. To all of you Star Trek fans of good character and noble ideals, to you in whom that flame of the upward reach of man still burns fervently, until we meet again, I bid you live long and prosper. And remember, as Commander Riker said, it's better than music. It's jazz.